Welcome to chapter 3, or what we would want to say is the carbohydrate chapter. So, we've kind of led up to the point where we've talked about the nuts and bolts of nutrition, and now what we're going to do is we're going to get into our first stage of the macronutrients, and carbohydrates being one of the most important. It doesn't mean that they're the most important, but we have to understand that macros, carbs, fats, proteins, we have to understand that in a specific amount for specific reasons and everything like that, they all hold a really different value depending upon what your goals are, what your needs are, who you are, what your makeup is, if you have any complications, illnesses, diseases, whatever. All right. So with carbohydrates, we need to think about them being a main fuel, one of the main fuel sources. Okay. So what is it? It is one of the three macros, like we just talked about. It is, again, a primary energy source, and it's definitely one of the primary energy sources for nervous system, the nerve cells, all right, the brain's first go-to, all right. So what makes it a little bit different is, a molecule is composed of a carbon, a hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. And when you look at it, if we were to actually physically type it out, glucose, or the flowing, moving within the bloodstream sugars that we have in our system is actually C, and then it would be underscore C6. Oops, I'm gonna take that down. H12O6. All right, and that is actually the chemical makeup. So there's your carbon, 6 carbon with 12 hydrogen and then 6 oxygen. So C6H12O6. All right, and many of the carbohydrates that we consume in our diet are coming from plant sources. Okay, so there's glucose, exactly what we just talked about, C6H12O6. We talked about how it's most abundant in, it's the most abundant carbohydrate just because of where it is and how it gets into our system. It is stored in plants when it's stored in our system. So just kind of for quick reference here, storage form in humans is called glycogen, and that probably will come up in a little bit, but at least we know that when it's stored in the liver or the muscle, that it's actually called glycogen. All right, so it is produced by plants through photosynthesis or the energy that comes from the sun, right, to break down and get uh, you know uh, glucose to be built and constructed so that it is stored within the plant itself. All right. So when we talk about carbohydrates, let's get into the first set. The first set we would talk about is simple. The other set we're going to talk about is complex. All right. So simple carbs, simple carbohydrates are sugars. They contain one or two molecules. If it's one molecule, it's a mono, meaning one sugar, one monosaccharide. All right. So, and those three types are glucose, fructose, and galactose. All right. Glucose, fructose, galactose. And then we have two molecule sugars, which are lactose, maltose, and sucrose. So what's the difference between them? Monosaccharides, and if we look right in this region right here, all right, on the right-hand side of this first set or the middle column, you'll see there's your galactose, glucose, and fructose. Like we said, three monosaccharides. Well, we know that glucose is a monosaccharide and it's its own entity, galactose and fructose as well. But when we add a glucose molecule to each one of those, you get your disaccharide. So adding two together, gives you a disaccharide. Glucose plus galactose gives us lactose. And if we know anything about sugars and we know anything about lactose, we know that it is a milk-based sugar. All right, so glucose plus galactose gives you lactose. Two glucose molecules gives you maltose. And those are typically your starches that you're going to find, okay? And then glucose plus fructose gives us sucrose, and sucrose is typically where we find that, like it says there, in sugar cane, we find it in sugar beets, we find it in honey, okay? So very, very sweet, all right? So those are the ways that we have our simple carbohydrates, all right? Moving through, if we look at complex carbohydrates, you can see here that they're no longer single and double molecules. They are basically chains. Complex carbohydrates are chains. Chains are dependent upon what it is that what type of polysaccharide they are. So it's starches, mostly found in, like it says here, grains, legumes, and tubers. Tubers being things like potatoes. All right. You'll have something called amylose, and you'll have amylopectin. All right. Those are two examples of starches. They're polysaccharides. Glycogen, like I said, is that storage form of glucose within us as humans. All right. And that's stored in the liver and the muscle. You can see here, again, long chain, and it branches off. And then fiber being more straight lined. Fiber you're going to find in, again, leaves, stems, and then plants themselves. Fiber, again, one of those things that is non-energy though, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So with complex carbs, there we go. There's our starches. Plants store carbohydrates as starch, and then, like it says here, humans digest starch into glucose, and then that glucose gets into the bloodstream and then travels to where it needs to go for either usage or storage. All right. Grains, legumes, and tubers, like we said before. On the other hand, you have your fiber. Fiber, like it says, is the non-digestible part of the plant. That's why it helps with the actual GI system, the gastrointestinal system, because it is allowed to flow through and it's not going to get absorbed within the walls of the small and large intestines. All right, so dietary fiber is that which is naturally occurring in food. Okay, so where is that found? Like it says there, whole grains, veggies, seeds, legumes, fruits. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why the other day when I was talking about in class with fruits, if you get rid of the skin on a lot of different things, like an apple, for example, you're losing a lot of the fiber that's based that has for a basis. All right. So dietary fiber, again, it's found naturally within food. Functional fiber, on the other hand, is that is added to food. So if you see here something like cellulose, guar gum, pectin, psyllium, those are types of fibers that are added back into a food for specific reasons. So when you look at like a food label and it says how much fiber you have, well, it could be either one or the other. All right, it just gives you the fiber count. So what we want to know about is it's total fiber, which is dietary plus functional. Well, if we know that a food naturally contains some, but yet we have something added in, you're going to have a total fiber number, but you're going to have both. Whereas sometimes it might just be dietary fiber, and then sometimes it might just be functional fiber, depending upon what the product is. All right. Now, on one end, you have something called soluble fiber, and with soluble, it is soluble in water, and it's viscous. So, like it says here, it can form a gel when wet. So, if it's soluble in water, it means it can break down. So typically, like citrus fruits, like your oranges, your grapefruits, your limes, lemons, right? Amongst others, nectarines, tangerines, things like that. Not nectarines, excuse me, like tangerines, and so on. Berries, oats, and then beans all contain soluble fiber. Now, beans, be careful of because although there's a little bit of there's fat in them and then there's fiber and there still is a decent amount of carbohydrates. So again, someone on a low carb diet thinks that beans are going to be their go-to for everything. You got to be very careful of that. Okay. So the other thing about soluble fiber is that it's really big on it really helps with risk reduction of, like it says there, cardiovascular disease, and it also it has an ability to decrease the risk of type 2 diabetes. Doesn't mean it gets rid of it, but just understand, it can help to reduce that part of it. Insoluble fiber, again, it doesn't break down in water, and that's the one that's really going to help with, like it says there, regular bowel movement. So again, with GI. So what we're saying there is that whole grains and specific vegetables that are filled with insoluble fiber are going to help with making sure things just flow better, and you may not be more apt for constipation and things like that. Okay. So just kind of going through here, we talked about also glycogen being a complex carb. It is stored in animals. So in if we're looking at ourselves here, we're looking at from a human standpoint, and we said that it's stored in liver and it's stored in muscle. All right. Now, when it's broken down, and it's broken down, glycogenolysis, to be broken down to be sent into the bloodstream or to be sent to the areas for usage as a fuel. Okay, it'll break down and it'll get into the bloodstream as glucose. Okay. The thing about glycogen, though, is that it's rarely, like it says here, rarely found in foods. So it's not a dietary source. It's not a true carbohydrate that you're going to consume on a regular basis. It's usually going to be glucose uptake, or actually, I should say, it's going to be carbohydrate intake that when you break down molecules of those complex or simple carbohydrates, they'll get shuttled into the working muscle. They'll get shuttled into the body, and when it gets to the small intestines, as a majority, what it does, it gets absorbed in and gets sent to either like we said, the liver or the muscles, where it'll go through gluconeogenesis, where now you're going to build up a storage form of glycogen. Okay. So looking at everything, here's like the whole grain. Now you can eat wheat germ, okay? You have the endosperm and then the bran. Now the bran, that's particularly where a majority of your fiber is found. So we have to be aware that there's specific parts that have to do specific things. So with a whole grain, this is what we're looking at, and we want to use the whole part of this whole grain. We want to use the entire whole grain so that we can get the most nutrient dense option that we can. All right. So there is a list here that if you want to go through, just understand that things like brown bread, enriched, refined, stone ground, what we're looking for here and for ourselves is we're looking for whole wheat flour, whole grain flour, wheat flour, and then stone ground is very big, very important. But what we're trying to be careful of, things like enriched, that's where it's a little bit that enriched, usually referring to more white breads, more like potato breads, things like that. It doesn't mean that they're 100% bad for you, but we got to be careful of what we're using it for. Okay. And then again, moderation is key for that. Unbleached, again, not so much, doesn't mean it's technically a whole grain, all right, but it's an unbleached flour, and it could be refined. All right. White flour, again, same thing. All right. So again, bleached and refined. So therefore, you're going to end up with, again, less fiber, less nutrient dense, more calorically dense. Actually, I wouldn't say calorically dense, but less nutrient dense, meaning what you're eating is really, you're not getting the most nutrient, bang for your buck that you could be. All right. So again, why do we eat carbohydrates? We said there's 4 calories per gram in it, and that's what we've gone over, from chapter 1. We know it's important for cells. We know it's proper for brain health, for brain cell functioning, all right, and also for red blood cells. Red blood cells actually have a really big affinity for carrying glucose to where it needs to go, all right. We know that glucose is highly important for exercise, whether it be anaerobic or aerobic, okay. So what happens is that if we have a problem breaking down carbohydrates, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have to find alternate sources of, alternate sources of glucose. And oftentimes what's going to happen is you're going to have to dig into proteins, because there are specific type of proteins that are called, you have glucose based, proteins that are found in your system that they can kind of act like a carbohydrate. They can be broken down so that they can eventually build up to what we say here, as it says here, gluconeogenesis, or the production of new glucose. All right. So we have to be aware that, sometimes under energy deficiency, if, carbs and fats run out, that's why proteins can be used. Or if you're on a low carb dieting, we also understand that protein breakdown occurs because we're trying to find new ways of getting glucose into our system. All right. Again, we've talked about how fiber can be really critical, but it's got more than just cardiovascular and type 2 diabetic risk breakdowns here. What we're saying too is fiber-rich carbs, we can get a reduction in potential cancer risk. So colon cancer being one of them. We said heart disease. It can help with weight management or weight loss. There's your type 2 diabetes. And then obviously with those aspects of GI distress, hemorrhoids, constipation, and then diverticulosis. And I believe, yep, here we go. With diverticulosis, if you look and see, what happens here is on the wall of your colon, you can actually get, you have diverticuli that are within the walls. And if those become inflamed, that really can cause a complication with your GI system. And it can really cause you to have a hard time going to the bathroom. It can cause really, really aggressive pain and very, very big discomfort. Okay, so we don't want to have diverticuli that go through the wall of the colon if we can help it. And then on top of that, if you see here, you can get fecal matter in there, and that's really what's going to make it inflamed because it's really irritated. So we have to try to avoid that, and that's why fiber will help all of this move and flush through. All right. So when we look at everything here in terms of digestion, carbohydrates are the only carb that starts at the mouth. Okay, the digestion of carbohydrates begins at the mouth, and here's why. Inside of our mouth, we have what we call salivary amylase. Now, if we see these right here, these letters right here, ASE, that means enzyme. All right, so salivary, within the saliva, amylase, or the enzyme that begins to break, or enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates within the mouth. And what happens here is carbs, upon chewing and everything like that, what happens is the salivary amylase gets into those carbohydrates and begins to break them down to maltose. Well, if you remember what maltose is, it's glucose plus glucose. It's a disaccharide. So therefore, what happens there is you're starting to break down these carbohydrates into smaller pieces so that they can get through the stomach where there's little digestion that occurs, and then they'll eventually make their way to the small intestines, okay? So once you get to the small intestines, what you'll end up with is pancreatic amylase, which again, there's that enzyme, the ASE, okay, pancreatic amylase. So what that is it's the enzymes that are produced within the pancreas that are released into the small intestine to then convert more of those carbohydrates into maltose. Okay. So starts in the mouth, not much happens. It kind of passes through the stomach. All the gastric juices are not really doing much for those carbohydrates. And what happens is they'll get shuttled to the small intestines where some of the molecules are going to get broken down, or a majority of them are now going to get broken down into maltose, so that you can then start to break those disaccharides down into monosaccharides, depending upon what they are. So you'll have maltase, sucrase, and lactase. Maltase breaks down maltose, sucrase breaks down sucrose, and lactase breaks down lactose. Well, that is how then monosaccharides, strands, single molecules of carbohydrates are now going to be released and absorbed from the small intestines, absorbed through the walls and sent into the bloodstream, and then gone to, either, again, the bloodstream itself, where they're going to be free-flowing. They might end up in the working muscles. They might end up in the liver, and that's what we're trying to send them to, okay? Well, if you recognize one of those, and that's lactase, the good thing about the bad thing about lactase is that some people just don't have it. Okay, so that's why people have lactose intolerance, and that's really insufficient lactase. So if you have insufficient lactase, you cannot break down lactose, so therefore you end up with GI distress, intestinal gas, bloating, nausea, cramping, diarrhea. All right, and typically with people who are lactose intolerant, typically you end up with those that cannot and usually do not consume large amounts of calcium. Excuse me. Let me bring that back because it's really there's a difference there. With lactose intolerant people, it's usually one of those things where they're not going to be able to have a lot of dairy products, and they're not going to be able to have, so cheeses, milks, all right, things that contain a lot of lactose, like ice cream, things like that. All right, so they do say you have to find alternate forms of calcium. Well, the thing about calcium is that you don't have to necessarily have all dairy based, which has lactose in it, milk sugar. All right, you don't have to have those sources to get all of your calcium, so this shouldn't be too much of a concern for those who have lactose intolerance. The only problem with that is that typically what you find is that those who do have a lactose intolerance, they kind of like they like cheese, they like milk, for example, so it's hard to kind of wean them off of it, but it's kind of one of those things that needs to be done. All right. So what do we got now? We got, everything going, we got all this glucose getting, sent on its merry way. Well, the liver converts all sugars into glucose. So it says here, once absorbed into the bloodstream, the monosaccharides are converted to glucose by the liver. All right. And then at that point there, that's your energy source. Then excess glucose can be stored as glycogen. Well, understand too that excess glucose that is converted to glycogen, well, if you have too much glucose, then what has to happen is there is a conversion of that too much glucose, especially if you are a sedentary person, that glucose will eventually find its way to then be converted into triglyceride storage inside of adipose tissue. So we got to be very careful of that, making sure we don't overdo what we don't need to overdo. All right. So again, with the digestion of carbs, that's why this is why I was explaining to you before that, fiber does not get broken down because we don't have the enzyme needed for it. Okay. There is bacteria within the large intestines that will break down some fiber, but not all. You're not going to denature all fiber. So, if you have a good amount of fiber in your diet per day, majority of it is not going to be broken down. It's going to move through those small intestines, move into the large intestines, and it's going to basically help to avoid that backup of feces. All right. So that's what we got to be aware of. So here's how, basically you have your small intestines. Here you go. And so everything coming from, as you see here, this little line in here, that everything coming from the stomach is going to get into the small intestines. And then from there, it's going to get shuttled out into the bloodstream and end up in the liver, where again, it's going to either be converted completely into glucose and sent off to the working muscles, sent off into the blood, or it's going to stay in the liver and it's going to be stored as glycogen. And if it gets sent off as glucose, it's going to make it to the working muscles, where it may have to either use it or store it. If they use it, they're going to use glucose for energy, or they may store it as glycogen. And there you go. And that's how we can have storage energy so that we're ready to exercise. All right. So this is the part where we have to really pay attention to, we know that blood glucose can be really a really bad, deleterious type of sugar that's in our system. So what needs to happen here is we have to work on that regulation. Well, if we as individuals are healthy, typically we do a really nice job of regulating glucose by kind of having that ebb and flow. When you eat, you'll have a spike in blood glucose. When you're kind of getting toward that fasting stage, meaning you haven't eaten for a while, then you have that lower level of glucose. So what happens is we have two hormones that are secreted by the pancreas that will help with regulation. One of them is what most people know about, and that's insulin. The other one is glucagon. All right, they both do a nice job of keeping that ebb and flow. So this is where we need to make sure that we know the difference between the two. Insulin, all right, it determines that when the pancreas is sent signals and it detects that there is too much glucose in the blood, then what happens is it'll release insulin from the beta cells of the pancreas, and insulin will shuttle out, and it'll basically pull blood glucose to the liver or working muscles so that it can be converted into glycogen for storage, and it lowers blood glucose back to a homeostasis amount level, or a control level. Whereas on the other hand, glucagon detects when you have low blood sugar. Okay, it's produced so when alpha cells produce glucagon, what's happened is the pancreas has been sent signals by the body to say that you're under low blood sugar. So what it wants to do is it wants to take glycogen, convert it to glucose, and send it into the bloodstream so that it can keep elevated blood sugar levels so you don't have that crash feeling or have that low feeling. Okay. So also, under certain conditions, you might end up again with gluconeogenesis, where at certain times you may have to have the production of new glucose from amino acids. That can also happen. So that means you be breaking down some muscle cells to be able to get amino acids to be converted into glucose for new energy. Okay. We kind of hit on this whole aspect here of the high blood glucose, but again, insulin secretion with cellular uptake and then glucose storage, okay? So that's one of the things that can happen there. The other thing that can happen, because insulin, we talked about this on Monday, for example, is that insulin helps things store. Well, we know that it doesn't, it doesn't distinguish one versus the other. What it does is it says, okay, we're going to store, glucose into the muscles as glycogen, but we also know that if we have too much of it, we're going to store, like I was saying before, under lipogenesis, new triglycerides that are made from those glucose molecules. So we got to be very careful and make sure we know how much is too much or how much is not enough. Okay, but really we're more concerned about how much is too much. Okay. So under low blood sugar, again, glucagon secretion, what you end up with is glycogenolysis, which is glucagon is going to make and convert stored glycogen into glucose, and then it's going to send it and release it into the bloodstream. All right, and then you also have gluconeogenesis, where again amino acids are going to be broken down from proteins in our system, and you're going to end up having those amino acids be converted into glucose and put into the bloodstream as well, so that you end up with higher levels of blood glucose in your system to help regulate bodily function. All right, so under hypoglycemic parts, that's like we said, that is one of those parts where it's low blood sugar. All right, it can be from, like it says here, excessive insulin production, and that's typically hypoglycemia. Low blood sugar, like, it could be from fasting, it could be post-workout. All right, it could be that you haven't eaten for a while and the body hasn't regulated itself very well, or it overshot. And what I mean by overshoot is it took too much blood sugar out if insulin, did its job too well. All right, and that's where you start getting the shakiness, the sweating, anxiety, the weakness, the irregular heartbeat. Sometimes you might get cool, clammy skin. All right, it just feels like and sometimes it makes you feel like you kind of want to pass out. Okay. So that really are the major components of that. So when it's like, okay, that's great and all, but what's going to happen with insulin or glucagon, and what's going to happen with blood glucose depending upon what I eat? Well, that's the thing that we have to understand, is that there's a specific what we call glycemic load, or part of the glycemic index, that we have to be aware of. Blood glucose is really one of those things that's regulated by what the glycemic load is. All right, now something that has a high glycemic load means that the foods that are high glycemic means that they're more simple and less complex. Those that are lower on the glycemic load are more complex carbohydrates. And what happens here is, when we talk about glycemic index, is the higher the glycemic index, the more simple the sugar is, meaning the more it's going to affect insulin. It's going to spike insulin because there's a lot of sugar in the system. If it's lower glycemic index, what that means is that typically you're going to have foods that usually might have more complex carbohydrates. They might have a little bit more fiber, and therefore what ends up happening is they have a low glycemic index, which means they don't spike insulin as high, but it doesn't mean that it won't spike it for as long, depending upon how much carb is in that food. So we got to be very aware of that. Okay, so low glycemic, that's really good for people who are diabetic. That's good for people who might be under the care for cancers or heart disease, anything like that. All right, so we got to be aware of that. And that's why glycemic load is very important. Dietitians have to pay attention to that a lot, because they can't be overshooting these blood glucose values for people with specific diets, because it can cause a negative situation within the body. All right. So if we look here, straight glucose, a lot of times we can consider that table sugar. All right. That is an instant 100, the highest you can get. Instant mashed potatoes are an 85. Okay. Rice Krispies are an 82. Now, so keep going down. White bread is a 73. White rice is a 56. All right. Bananas are 52. Now, oat bran bread is a 47. So this is where I think sometimes the dilemma, the dilemma of brown rice versus white rice. Well, white rice is a 56. Now, brown rice is very similar to that of like oat bran bread. So a 56 to a 47 is really not that much of a difference when it comes to glycemic index, but that it scares others enough that it has to make a change. So, again, from my perspective, if white rice is something that you'd rather have than brown rice, then I don't really think it's going to be a major difference. But again, to each their own, but just something to think about, food for thought. Kidney beans being super low, apples, again, they're high in natural sugars, have a lot of fiber, but that's really the main reason why it's kind of low on that glycemic index. All right. That's why it takes an apple so long to break down as well, because it's very fiber prone. All right. Now, carb-wise, we know that remember, this is from 45 to 65% was based on, from day one, AMDRs, or acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, of 45 to 65% per day. Well, we said on Monday that number can vary greatly depending upon if you're an athlete, a regular person, low carb, high carb, zone diet. It doesn't matter what it is. All right. But what are we saying here? The RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, is about 130 grams per day to make sure that we have enough glucose for the brain. So what we're saying here is that if we go below that 130 grams and start getting into like those low carb dieting, what's going to happen is the brain is not going to get sufficient amounts of glucose, so it's going to try to find alternate sources. And particularly those alternate sources are ketones. But that's for the fat chapter when we go over that. So understand that per day, the brain needs about 130 grams of carbs per day. So what we're saying is, at a minimum, to supply the brain with proper, nutrients, we got to take in, usually about 130 to 150 grams of carbs per day. But that, again, that's an RDA. So again, take that with a grain of salt as well. All right. Now, on the bottom of that page, if you look, it's again more fiber-rich, more unprocessed carbohydrates, so more natural-based foods. Okay. More fiber-rich vegetables and fruits over more breads, things like that. We want more natural products if we can. But that's, again, if you like whole grain bread, there's nothing wrong with it. If you like oatmeal, there's nothing wrong with it, with oats and things like that. So it just depends on what your palate is. All right, so simple sugars. The thing about simple sugars is they're not all bad, okay? But we'll talk about those questions at the bottom before we get in. But let's go to the top part here first. They can cause dental problems because simple sugars are pretty tough on, enamel. They're tough on that total tooth health, right? And for the gums as well. Like it says here, it may contribute to unhealthy levels of blood lipid levels. So it can, because you're taking too many simple sugars in, you have a change in blood lipid profile, can change cholesterol levels, it can change triglyceride levels just because you're having too much of it. It can be a cause of hyperactivity, and it may not be the root cause, but it can be a cause. And there has been some contributing factors, from research to show that obesity and diabetes definitely can be caused by simple sugars. So again, what's the deal? Like, are simple sugars bad for us? To me personally, from a professional standpoint, simple sugars are necessary for certain times. But let's get into these questions first. What can you do to avoid overconsumption of sugar? Well, we got to think about it. What are we looking for? Again, more natural-based products, things that are, if you're looking at a food label, look at all the added sugar values, things like that. Versus if it just says sugar, that means regularly occurring sugar. Then the other question we have to think about is, why is added sugar unhealthy? What diseases, we already talked about some of that. Obesity is almost considered a disease now. Diabetes, we know it's a disease. All right. Gum disease can come from that. And gum disease can be just as worse because we talked about plaque buildup and things like that. All right. So, and then what are some replacement tactics that can help cut back on our want of added sugar? Don't think artificial sweeteners, because those can be just as bad. Okay. So, again, simple sugars, my rule of thumb is that if you're going to have simple sugars and you are an avid exerciser, simple sugars are something that you need post-exercise. They need to be post-exercise because you want to get them into the working muscles as quickly as possible and to be able to replenish your glycogen stores, get glucose into the bloodstream to get to the liver and to the working muscles to replenish glycogen that has been broken down from your exercise. That's not a bad thing. Okay, that's why simple sugars post-workout are okay. Fiber-rich carbs, okay, definitely pay attention. 38 grams a day for men, 25 grams per day for women. That's an adequate intake. That means that's going to be enough in your diet to make sure that you're getting the right nutrients that you need to be able to sustain regular, like I said, GI health and regular functioning of cells, okay? But the problem here is this right here. Most Americans eat only about half of that, if half of that, all right? There's your whole grain foods are obviously a really good choice for that. But again, you can find fiber-rich veggies. You can find fiber-rich fruits. So, but what we're trying to do is avoid those added sugars, okay? Excessive fiber, you know, and usually if people overdo it, like even, and all joking aside, people joke around about things like Metamucil, which is the powder-based fiber. But people who take, too much of it can end up with, gas or bloating. They can end up with dehydration. If you're not consuming enough water, all right? It can also, because it flushes through your system, what's also happening is you're not absorbing certain nutrients because that fiber is also flushing anything else that's going through the small intestines and then into the large intestines as well. And then, like it says here, malnutrition can occur. So you might not, because you're feeling full all the time from too much fiber, you're not eating enough. And sometimes, and as we know, not eating enough is almost as bad as, overeating. So got to be paying attention to those characteristics as well. So fiber-rich carbs, well, let's look at our legumes. Navy beans contain about 10 grams of fiber per half cup. Lentils, about 8 grams. Black beans, about 7 to 8. Kidney beans, about 7. All right, look at your fruits. 1 cup of blackberries gives us about 8 grams of fiber. That's just 1 cup. 1 cup of strawberries, about, 3 to 4? And 1 banana has about 3. So you can see, you can start adding up your fiber as you go through the day. Broccoli, surprisingly enough, bunch of fiber for being just a vegetable. For every cup, it's about 5 grams. So you see here, you start putting all these whole foods into your system. Then we're starting to talk about something really, really good. Because now we're getting an abundance of different kinds of food. So that's really important for that. Really, really important about having a variety as well, because with variety and different types of carbohydrates, you can see here, you can have beans, you can have fruits, you can have vegetables, you can have breads, and you're doing it right, okay? So that's really important when it comes to an overall high quality diet. All right. I talked about alternate or alternative sweeteners before, but just understand that they're out there. Whoops, a little bit too quick. But one thing that I talked about the other day was sugar alcohols. They're really big in gums and things like that. But be careful of sugar alcohols. Although I will say, people who are prone to use what's called xylitol, okay, right here, and there's also an artificial called erythritol or xylitol. It can cause, like it says, diarrhea. So people who cook with alternative sweeteners, they might have that feeling of that gastro distress. So if we looked at alternative sweeteners for baking, all right, actually it has down here. So if we went into here, if you look, sometimes you'll see something like Swerve, all right, that's one example of an artificial sweetener. But I'm trying to find, so if we look here, Splenda, got to be careful of sometimes Splenda can be, Sunnit, Equal, NutraSweet, and those are some of the ones that can be used that are, really, really, can be really, really harsh on the system because they don't break down. The body doesn't break it down. It just kind of shoves it through. All right. And, there's lots of ways that we can look through here to see, oh, well, what do we, what can we use for alternatives for baking? Well, sometimes better off just to use the sugar than it is to have a chemical-based type of artificial sweetener. And like I said, it's found pretty regularly. And there it is, erythritol, like I was telling you about before. Xylitol, also called erythritol, so it's a no calorie. So that's why sometimes people kind of transition to that. All right. But sugar alcohols, again, what I was trying to get to besides those aspects was that they actually can, and there's been some research that has shown that sugar alcohols can actually produce a insulin spike. All right, alternative sweeteners can actually cause this fake feeling of sweetness, and the body adjusts by causing an insulin spike, even though there's no sugars that we're taking in. So we have to understand that too. So you got to be very careful if you're working with diabetics and things like that. All right, so here's some more. Some of the things to take into consideration are the sweetness levels. Saccharin, all right, 300 times more sweet than sucrose, and sucrose is about as sweet as you can get. Acid sulfame potassium, about 200 times sweeter. Acid sulfame K, which K stands for potassium, that's found in a lot of like energy drinks. That's why like Monster and those types of companies, they have acid sulfame potassium because number one, it provides a sweetness, and number two, it has no calorie energy to it. Okay. There's your sucralose like Splenda, again 600 times sweeter. Neotame, all right, you can find that it's about 7,000 times sweeter than sucrose. So you can see here that there's a lot of things that it's a sweetness factor, and that's why a lot of times when you have like diet sodas versus a regular soda, not that I condone soda, but what I'm saying here is that these types of things that you're looking at, these artificial sweeteners, they actually are they're sweeter, and they give that soda a distinct different taste. Certain foods that have them in it give it a distinctly different taste versus the real thing of sugar because they're that much sweeter. Okay. So interestingly enough, like it says here, the amount of food that a 50-pound child or a 150-pound adult would have to consume each day to exceed the ADI, the average diet intake for aspartame. All right. What we're saying here is that, seven seven servings or 20 servings can actually exceed that, and that's what that's where it can get a little scary, is that too much and you don't realize you're even having it most of the time. All right, so we got to pay attention to that and be very, very careful, because we don't want to overdo it on things like aspartame, because that can cause massive complications, and therefore you can end up with toxicity within the blood if that gets down to it. All right. So we talked about carbs, we talked about how insulin and glucagon work, but let's talk about the aspect of diabetes, all right, and how diabetes is an effect of excessive carbohydrate intake, amongst other things. But really with diabetes, you can't control blood glucose like you normally can. There are 3 types, all right, but the 4th is not a type, it's more of what we keep consistently across class, okay, and that is type 1 diabetes, which is, again, we say juvenile. Type 2, we call adult onset. All right, gestational, during pregnancy. All right, but type 1 being also insulin dependent, and then non-insulin dependent. Okay, so that's where insulin's going to help someone regulate their blood glucose with type 1. Insulin may be okay for some people, but it may not be for others. So type 2 diabetes, again, insulin may work for some, but it's pretty much where you're going to be more medication bound at that point. But what we're saying here is, at some point, you're looking at, nerve damage, neuropathy. You're looking at, kidney damage, nephropathy. All right. And then, blindness, actually, where the eyes, retinopathy, where you can actually go blind, where there's, and also too, there can be, because there's so much pressure in the eyes, that's what's causing those nerves to become damaged and you can not see anymore. There may be a need for amputation, and then obviously diabetes can lead to death if it's not taken care of. All right. So, if you look here, there's some symptoms, but just because you're constantly hungry doesn't mean you're type 1 diabetic. But typically, again, it's juvenile, or, it happens in children. Usually it happens up to about the age of 10, and then it's pretty rare to get it as an adult, but it doesn't mean you can't. All right, type 2 diabetes, on the other hand, it's rare for it to be found in children, although recently we're having issues with that, where we're finding it in children more and more now. but it's found predominantly in adults, and you can see here where you can see all the signs and symptoms that come with it. All right. So again, there we go. Juvenile or insulin dependent counts for about, I think right now it says about 10% of cases. The last time I did some research on this, it showed to be about 8% of all cases. It was like 7 to 8% in that range between, depending upon what articles you were reading. And then the other 92 to 93% were type 2, or roughly about that, because you had your gestational, which means during pregnancy. So what are we talking about here with type 1? You don't produce enough insulin, so therefore you got to have insulin injections. All right. It can be an autoimmune concern. It could be from environmental exposures, those types of things. All right. But what's happening? You're causing hyperglycemia or high blood sugar, and your body can't regulate it, so you got to take the insulin to regulate it externally. Type 2, on the other hand, again, adult onset or non-insulin dependent. There's approximately 90%. Your cells, your receptors are not responsive to insulin at all. All right. So again, at that point, excessive insulin is produced, but it's just not doing anything. Okay. So we got to be very careful of that. Now, the cause is unclear. It can be genetic predispositions. Obviously, obesity plays a part in that. Physical inactivity plays a part in that. But you can't base it solely on what your family background is. Okay. So again, weight loss, diet, exercise, some oral medications, and then insulin if necessary. All right. But really changing the lifestyle of a person really can make a huge difference. Well, how do we know where we're at? If we look here at the numbers, if you have an 8-hour fasted blood glucose test for 2 consecutive tests that you have on different days, and it's 126 or higher, that indicates that you are diabetic. Also, you can get tested for an HbA1c test, and if you're above 6.5%, which means glycosylated hemoglobin, which means how much glucose is adhered to your hemoglobin, what we're saying there is that you stand this chance of anything above 6.5% that's making up your red blood cells is that 6.5% means that you're in that diabetic range. All right. There's your pre-diabetes. There's those levels. Anything from 100 to 125, and anything below 100 means you're normal. Okay. And then lastly, pre-diabetic stuff, you have to be very, very on point and trying to change those lifestyle factors before you end up with massive concerns of actually having diabetes. And then lastly, like I was saying before, I forgot about diabetes. If we look here, metabolic syndrome is potentially a combination of type 2 diabetes, which is T2DM, type 2 diabetes mellitus. But it's a combination of that, which means, problem with blood glucose levels. There's an issue with excessive waist circumference, high blood pressure, high triglycerides and total cholesterol values, abnormal HDL versus LDL levels, and then there's your blood glucose levels as well. All right. So something very severe that can happen if we're not paying attention to our carbohydrate intake. We also need to be paying attention to, our lifestyle habits. What are we doing? What types are we eating? What are we getting exercise? Things like that, so that we can do a better job of regulating, so we don't have to worry about diabetes. Okay. So again, carbohydrates right there. Plant-derived based foods. Understanding that carbohydrates are very important for the system. Understanding that, carbohydrates are necessary for exercise. They're needed for athletic competition. And as we get more and more into this class, you're going to start seeing that when we start doing, specific types of exercise training and everything like that, carbohydrate levels can change to help us to be able to get us to where we need to be. And then carbohydrates definitely come up more when we get into exercise physiology, because we need to understand how carbohydrates then break down in our muscles to use them for energy. And that's where understanding these nuts and bolts will help us in that class as well. All right. So I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation on carbs, because it's one of the more, fun, ways of talking about it, because it really does have a lot to do with everything that we do in terms of exercise. And we can also see that if we overdo it, it can lead to negative consequences, which obviously we don't want to have. So I hope everybody has a great evening. Have a great weekend and enjoy.